My daughter-in-law called me to ask for money, just 3 days after I found out my son had gotten married without inviting me. 3 days. The wedding had already happened. 140 people had already raised a glass. And I found all of that out not from an invitation because there was no invitation, but from a phone call my son made while I was doing 75 on I-70 heading back from a property walk near Limon. He told me casually, "The way you'd mentioned that you'd already eaten and didn't need dinner. We got married a few weeks ago, Dad. Small thing, very intimate. 140 people. That's not intimate. That's a statement. I want to tell you what that felt like, because I think the feeling matters more than the facts. It wasn't anger, not right away. It was the sensation of reaching for something on a shelf and finding the shelf gone. Just recalibration. A half second of free fall before your hand finds something else to hold. I kept driving. I watched the planes open up on both sides of the highway, and I let a semi merge in front of me, even though there was no reason to, and I breathed through it, and I thought, what kind of man does that? What kind of man raises a son who decides, consciously, that his father doesn't fit the aesthetic of the most important day of his life? I'll tell you what kind. The kind I had been for 28 years. That's the honest answer, and I'm going to give you the honest answer throughout this because I think you deserve it, and because I think I owe it to myself to stop dressing this up. My name is Martin. I'm 63 years old. I spent 3 decades buying distressed commercial properties in secondary markets around the Denver metro area, warehouses, strip lots, aging flex space buildings that nobody else wanted. I fixed them up. I leased them out. I held them. It was not glamorous work. My hands knew what a corroded pipe fitting smelled like. I wore the same brand of work boots for 12 years because they did the job and I didn't see the point in changing what worked. By the time I turned 60, I owned 5 properties outright and had a small residential portfolio on the side. Nothing flashy, but it was mine. Every callus was a receipt. My wife Elena died when our son Connor was 18. Ovarian cancer. We had 7 months between the diagnosis and the morning I sat in a hospital chair and watched her chest stop moving, and I held her hand long after it went cold because I wasn't ready to let go of the weight of it. She was the better half of everything, sharper with people, warmer in rooms, better at reading what was happening beneath what was being said. She saw things I missed. She always had. After she was gone, it was just me and Connor in a house in Lakewood that was suddenly too quiet and too large and full of her things. And I want to be honest about what happened next, because the honest version is not flattering to me. I overcompensated. I know that now. At the time, I told myself I was stepping up, that I was being present, that I was honoring Elena by making sure Connor didn't fall through the cracks of grief. So when his grades slipped senior year, I hired tutors. When he took a gap year that stretched into 2, I gave him space and a monthly transfer. When he was 23 and had a business idea that went nowhere, I funded the attempt without asking hard questions. When he moved to Capitol Hill at 26 with a woman named Brianna and needed help with the deposit, I wired it before he finished asking. I want to tell you about Brianna before I go any further, because she is a significant part of this story, and I want to be fair to her. She was not a bad person in obvious ways. She was composed. She dressed carefully. She called me Martin from the first introduction, which felt forward, but I chalked it up to generational style. She complimented my properties in a way that landed less like admiration and more like inventory. She was warm to Connor, though, genuinely affectionate with him, and Connor seemed lighter around her in those early years, seemed to laugh more easily, and so I kept any reservations I had to myself. What I should have paid attention to and didn't was the way she talked about money. Not greedily. That would have been easier to spot. She talked about it the way some people talk about weather, as a condition of life that simply existed and was either favorable or not. Favorable meant access. She never seemed to question whose access it was. Over the 4 years before everything fell apart, the monthly support I sent Connor grew steadily from $900 to $2,300. It never happened in one jump. There was always a reason that made sense in isolation. Car repair. A medical situation neither of them had insurance for. A professional development course Connor described as a real turning point. That last one cost $2,800, and I never saw any professional development come out of it. I paid for Brianna's emergency dental work once $2,600 because the infection was serious, and I wasn't going to let someone suffer over money. Each individual expense had a logic. Together, they had a pattern I refused to look at. The February, before everything changed, I noticed the automatic monthly transfer had been routing to an account I didn't recognize. Connor had asked me months earlier to update a routing number. I'd done it without looking closely. When I mentioned it on the phone, he said it was a joint account, that it was just simpler. I said okay. I let it go. I'm not sure what I was avoiding by letting it go. I think I was avoiding the conversation that lived on the other side of that question. That spring afternoon on I-70, my phone rang at 4:15 the afternoon. Connor, we talk twice a week, usually short calls. How are you? How's the knee? How's work? He sounded distracted, scattered in a way I'd learned not to push against. I asked if everything was all right. He said, great, actually, and then, Dad, there's something we've been meaning to tell you. I thought, someone's pregnant. What he said was this. Brianna and I got married, about 3 weeks ago. We kept it low-key, really intimate, just close friends. I said, I'm sorry, what? He said it again, slightly differently. The ceremony was small. They wanted it to be just their people, their vibe. I asked how many people were there. He paused, not a long pause, but one I'll remember for the rest of my life, and then he said, I don't know, maybe 140? I didn't respond immediately. I watched a rest stop sign go by. I felt the steering wheel in my hands. I felt my own breathing slow down in the way breathing slows when your body is managing something your mind hasn't fully caught up to yet. I said, why wasn't I there, Connor? Another pause. And then he said, it just wasn't that kind of event, Dad. We wanted it to be among our people, our peers, among their peers. I said, okay. I said congratulations. I told him I'd call him later in the week. I hung up and I drove in silence for 45 minutes without turning on the radio, and I looked at the exit signs going by and I tried to understand what had happened. Honestly, and I say this to you directly, I don't know how I kept driving. I don't know how I stayed in my lane and kept my hands steady and made it back to Denver without pulling over on the shoulder and just sitting there until the sky went dark. Some part of me was operating on autopilot, while another part was doing the very slow, very quiet work of reckoning. I thought about Elena. I thought about what she would have said. She would have been devastated in a way she wouldn't have let Connor see. But she also would have known something I was only beginning to understand, that this didn't come from nowhere. This came from us. From the choices we made, the choices I kept making alone after she was gone. A child does not become a man who finds his father aesthetically inconvenient for his wedding without spending years learning that lesson somewhere. I did not call back that week. I needed to sit with it. 3 days later, at 8:40 in the morning, my phone rang. Not Connor, Brianna. She said, Martin, I hope you're not too upset about the wedding. We really did keep it very small, just the people who fit what we were going for. Anyway, the reason I'm calling is that we went a little over on the wedding costs and rent is coming up this week. I was wondering if you could transfer a little extra on top of the usual, maybe $4,000. Just this once to bridge the gap. $4,000 on top of the $2,300 I was already sending. Called 3 days after telling me I didn't belong at their wedding. I sat there at my kitchen table, coffee getting cold in front of me. The window looking out at the backyard where Elena had planted a cottonwood tree the year we moved in, which was now enormous and had started to lean slightly east. I looked at that tree, and I thought about the word Brianna had just used. Family. She had used it to explain why this request wasn't uncomfortable. Because we were family. I understood then what she meant by family, and I want to explain it to you clearly because I think it is important. She meant a door that only opens one way. She meant the kind of family you belong to when there is something to access and leave, when there is something to explain. She did not mean it cruelly. She meant it the way someone means a word they have never examined. She had walked into a house where the lights were always on, and the heat was always running, and no one had ever handed her a bill. And she had adjusted to the temperature of that house. That was the house I built. I said I'd think about it. I got off the phone. I called my accountant that afternoon. Then I called my attorney. Not to make any moves yet, I wanted the full picture before I did anything. That's how I've always operated in business, and it had never failed me. What I learned sharpened things considerably. Connor's name was listed as a secondary beneficiary on 2 of my properties, an arrangement I'd made years ago as a gesture of trust and forward planning. My attorney explained that this was worth reviewing in light of the current situation. My accountant and I then did something I should have done years earlier. We ran the numbers. $91,000. That is what I had transferred to my son over 6 years. Monthly support, dental work, the course, car repairs. I later found out cost twice what I'd been told. Deposits. One-time requests that became patterns. $91,000 sent to a man I loved, who had decided 3 weeks ago that I was not the right kind of person to stand in a room while he married someone. I did not send the $4,000. I did not send that month's regular transfer either. I sent Connor a text that said I was doing some financial reorganization and would be in touch when I had more clarity. He didn't respond for 3 days. When he did, it was 2 words. "You okay?" I said I was fine. Reorganizing. He said okay. 2 more days. Then he called. And this was a different Connor than the one I'd been speaking to for years. His voice had an edge to it, not hostile exactly, but taut, like a wire that had been tightened one turn too many. He said, "Dad, we've got bills. Rent was due 2 days ago. What's going on?" I said, "I know." He said, "Are you going to transfer it?" I took a breath. I thought about Elena. I thought about that late-night conversation we'd had when Connor was maybe 9 years old. One of those quiet kitchen conversations you have after the kid is finally asleep, and you're both tired but not sleepy. She had looked at me over her coffee cup and said, "Promise me you'll let him be uncomfortable sometimes. Promise me you won't fix everything." I had promised her. And then she got sick, and he got sad, and I forgot the promise completely, or I chose to forget it, which is worse. I said, "Liam, you're 30 years old. You've been married for 4 weeks. This is a conversation you need to have with your wife, not your father." He said, "You're doing this because of the wedding." I said, "I'm doing this because of a lot of things I should have done years ago. The wedding was just the morning I finally looked clearly at what I'd been looking at for a long time." He said that wasn't fair. I said, "What part isn't fair? The $91,000 I've sent you since you were 24? Or the part where you decided I wasn't welcome at your wedding?" Silence. Not the comfortable kind. The kind where someone is trying to locate a response and not finding one. And then, quietly, almost to himself, Connor said, "I thought you had more than enough." I want you to sit with that sentence for a moment, because I have sat with it for months. I thought you had more than enough. He wasn't being cruel. He wasn't being strategic. He was being honest. And that honesty revealed something about what my decades of provision had actually communicated to him. Not that I loved him. Not that I was there for him. What it communicated was, the abundance exists. The abundance absorbs. The abundance does not have feelings about how it is taken. Because abundance doesn't feel anything, it just replenishes. I said, "I do have more than enough. That's not the point." He said, "Then what is the point?" I said, "The point is that you never once asked yourself whether it was yours to take." I heard him breathing. I heard Brianna's voice in the background, low, asking something I couldn't make out, and I said, "Connor, I love you. I want a real relationship with you. But I am done funding a life you have never had to think about with a woman who called me for rent money 3 days after telling me I wasn't the right kind of person for your wedding. That is finished. If you want to talk, I'm here. If you want to build something real, as 2 adults who actually know each other, I'm here. But the account is closed." He said, "Dad, you can't just..." I said, "Welcome to adulthood. I love you." And I hung up. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, because I think people expect relief or righteousness from a story like this, that cinematic moment where the music swells and you feel vindicated. That is not what I felt. What I felt was hollow. I felt the specific exhaustion of a person who has just done the right thing years too late. I thought about the promise. I thought about the years of transfers. I thought about how easy it had been to keep sending the money, how it had felt like love, how it had let me pretend I was close to him when actually I was just funding the distance. If you have ever loved someone so much that you made them worse, you know the particular weight of what I'm describing. It doesn't feel like failure at the time. It feels like devotion. It looks exactly like devotion. And then one Tuesday afternoon you sit at a kitchen table with cold coffee, and you do the math and you realize that devotion, unaccompanied by honesty and expectation, is just a slow erosion of the person you're trying to protect. Connor called twice more over the following 2 weeks. Both calls were about money, not about the wedding, not about us, not about anything that mattered beyond the immediate pressure of bills. Brianna called once. I let it go to voicemail. The message was 9 minutes long. I listened to the first 90 seconds, and then I put the phone face down on the counter and went and checked on the cottonwood tree, which the arborist had said needed attention on the east side. I spent an afternoon with my attorney going through the beneficiary arrangements. I revised them. I want to be precise about my intention here, because it matters to me that you understand it correctly. I did not do this to punish Connor. I did it because I realized I had built my entire estate planning around a version of my son that had not existed for a decade, if it had ever truly existed at all. I had been making decisions based on hope rather than reality, and my attorney was right that those two things require different documents. I also, for the first time in 6 years, sat down and made a proper accounting of my finances. Not out of anger, though I was angry, but because I realized I had spent years letting money flow out of my life toward people who had never been asked to value it, and I needed to understand what I actually had, and what I actually wanted to do with it. Elena would have caught this years before I did. She was better with people. She read the underneath of things. She would have sat Connor down at 25 and asked him the questions I'd been afraid to ask because I didn't want to see what the answers would be. She would have been kinder than me in the delivery, and harder than me in the truth. About 6 weeks after the highway phone call, I drove out to look at a small warehouse property near Brighton, a nothing drive, flat and industrial, no scenery. But I rolled the window down anyway because the air was warm. Some song I didn't recognize was on the radio, and for the first time in a very long time, maybe since Elena got sick, maybe longer, I felt like the inside of my chest matched the outside of the day. I felt like the road ahead of me was mine. I thought about that kitchen conversation when Connor was 9. Her coffee cup, her voice. Promise me you'll let him be uncomfortable sometimes. I had promised. I had broken it. And the breaking of it had cost us both. Something real had cost him the chance to build the muscles a person needs to carry their own life, and had cost me a son who saw me as a peer rather than an ATM with feelings. That is the part that stayed with me. Not the 91,000, not the wedding, not Brianna's voicemail, the broken promise, and what it had made of both of us. Connor reached out about 8 weeks after I closed the account. Not about money. He sent a long message, not quite an apology, but something working toward one. He said he'd been thinking. He said some of what he'd done wasn't things he was proud of. He mentioned that things with Brianna were difficult, which I received without taking any satisfaction in, though I won't pretend I was entirely surprised. He asked if we could have lunch. We had lunch. It was awkward and short, and we didn't resolve anything. But he came without Brianna, which meant something. He looked different, tired, in a particular way I recognized. The way a person looks when they've been solving problems on their own for the first time, and the solving has been harder than they expected. I didn't say I told you so. I didn't bring up the $91,000. I ordered a sandwich and asked him about his week, and I listened. At the end, he said, "I'm sorry I didn't invite you to the wedding, Dad." I said, "I know." He said, "It was wrong. I don't know what I was thinking." I said, "Yeah, it was." We sat with that for a moment, both of us in it, neither of us running from it. And then, old habit, I picked up the check. We walked out into the parking lot, and I hugged my 30-year-old son, who had a lot of catching up to do, and who I loved more than I had ever found the right language for, and who was, for the first time in years, going to have to figure out how to carry some of the weight himself. I drove home alone. The cottonwood was pruned. The buildings were doing fine. There was a bottle of red wine in the kitchen that I'd been saving for no reason in particular. That night, for no reason in particular, I opened it, poured a glass, stood at the window, looked at the tree Elena had planted in the yard that had grown enormous and slightly crooked and beautiful, the way things grow when no one manages them too carefully. I thought about what she would say if she could see where we'd ended up. I think she'd say we were going to be all right. I think she'd be right. I've had a lot of time now to think about what this story actually is, not as a thing that happened to me, but as a pattern I built and maintained one small choice at a time. The honest answer is that every transfer I sent was a decision I made. Every hard conversation I avoided was a choice. I told myself it was love, and it was love. But it was love without a spine. Love that refused to let him feel the weight of anything. And weight, I understand now, is not cruelty. Weight is what builds a person. You cannot carry everything for someone, and then be genuinely surprised when they do not know how to carry anything. That is not a mystery. That is cause and effect. The most important thing I can tell you if you are a parent, if you love someone, if you are the person in your family who always absorbs the hard thing so others don't have to feel it, is this: comfort given reflexively is not kindness. It is fear wearing kindness's clothes. The real gift, the one my wife understood and I forgot, is the confidence that comes from knowing you can handle what is hard. That is what I failed to give Connor. That is what I am slowly, clumsily, honestly making room for now. Ask yourself this: is there someone in your life you have been carrying so long that they have forgotten they have legs? That question changed things for me. It might do the same for you. If you've watched this far, I want to ask you directly. Drop a number in the comments. 1. If you think I should have cut the support off years earlier. 2. If you think I handled the confrontation the right way. 3. If you think I should have said more at that lunch. I read them. I think about them. Your perspective matters to me. And if you're watching this at midnight somewhere across the world, or on your lunch break, or on the couch trying to make sense of something in your own life that feels a little like this, tell me where you are and what time it is there. I like knowing this story travels. If this hit something real for you, consider subscribing. Not because I'm asking you to click a button, but because this kind of honesty, the kind that costs something to say, is what this channel is built on. I'd like to keep building it with you. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Denver, Colorado to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.